Welcome back to Off-Grid K&A. Today we're talking about food security, or rather food insecurity. If you think about what's been going on in the past 2 years or so with food chain supplies, it really does not make anybody, I don't think, very confident to see what's happened with the regular chain of supply, to be confident that our food chain supply is going to continue to be there for anyone and everyone. So specifically, this video is talking about food prepping and the considerations that you should take into account if you are going to food prep. Obviously, if you're thinking about food prepping, you're going right back to the basics. So I'm not talking about processed foods. I'm not talking about the foods that are preserved, unless they're naturally preserved. I'm not talking about foods that come out of a can necessarily, or a box, maybe a bag, but not like a box like Kraft Dinner. We're not talking about those sorts of things. You're looking at your food pyramid, which is your grains, your proteins, your fruits and vegetables, and your dairy, really. So when you think about food prepping and you think about a food chain, it's really important, I think, especially in today's society, to be able to make sure that you have your own food chain supply set up and to be able to make sure that you are self-sufficient as much as possible. Now, you can't completely get away from the system, unfortunately, because at some point or another, you are reliant upon other people or other systems. But there are ways to mitigate the fact that you're reliant on a global food system and that you're reliant on the global food chain. Because it only takes one link to be broken for the whole chain to be out of whack. One link. Not 2 or 3 or 4, but just one. So being self-sufficient and making sure that you can do those things by yourself and you can provide as much food for yourself as possible or within your little community is really important. And that's what today's video is about. These are my top 6 considerations that I would say are very important things in sort of a grid down shtf situation, but to also keep in mind for food security in general. So the ideal situation in a grid down shtf situation is going to be able to stay in one place, to be able to still have power, and to be able to have mitigated that food chain supply issue by having your own community or by being as self-sufficient as possible. That's not going to be too many people at all. So the top 6 considerations for food security, and I would say this is the first one. Your first consideration for your food security: are you going to be mobile? Are you going to have to be mobile, or are you able to stay in one place? Most people in a grid down situation are going to have to at some point be mobile. So it's very difficult to be mobile and have some sort of food security. That means you have to take into account the other situations that may arise when you're on the move. That means you need to take into account how you're getting your food when you're on the move. And that means you need to take into account how you're getting other people in your immediate circle food when you're on the move. So hunting skills are going to be a consideration here, and foraging is going to be something else that you want to look into. Another sort of way around that would be caches. If you've kind of planned where you're going and you've kind of mapped out your whole situation in a grid down situation, if you're able to provide food caches for yourself and for presumably the people you're taking with you in a grid down situation, then that's something to definitely do. The danger with food caches is that if somebody else finds them, obviously they're going to be rendered useless. So that's something to consider, but it's an idea nonetheless. Your second consideration actually ties into the first one, whether you have power or you have no power. Now, if you're mobile and on the move, clearly you are not going to be able to access power as easily as someone who is stationary. I know that there's lots of different portable power devices that you can take with you. However, that's only a short-term solution because eventually that thing, a battery of some sort, presumably, is going to run out of power and you're not going to have anything to be able to provide power with. So being able to locate sources of power or learn to deal without is another consideration that you're going to need to take into account. The third thing would be physical fitness. And I don't mean this in the sense of you have to be a bodybuilder or you have to be somebody who is super jacked and super strong. I mean in terms of your functional fitness. If it is a grid down situation, you're going to need excessive levels of cardio and stamina, really, to be able to go hunting, to be able to walk potentially a kilometer or two a day. You're going to need to be in good physical shape. If you're going to be traipsing through bushes, if you're going to be foraging for food, if you're going to be catching something with a bow and arrow or with traps or with snares or whatever else, you're going to have a very high level of functional fitness. That doesn't mean that you have to be a skinny mini or you have to be an extreme bodybuilder, but it does mean that you need to be fit. That rides along with the fourth thing. If you're going to be catching your own food or killing your own food, regardless of how you catch your food or how you kill your food, you're going to need some sort of weapon. That could be a bow and arrow, that could be a slingshot, that could be a firearm, that could be anything that is a weapon of choice. I mean, a heavy rock will do, but it's not necessarily the best choice for killing an animal. Regardless, you're going to need some sort of tool or some sort of tools, because nobody kills a rabbit with their bare hands or kills a chicken with their bare hands. You can definitely go foraging and forage for food with your bare hands because that's more plants. But if you want any sort of meat, if you want to be able to catch any sort of meat, you're going to need some sort of weapon. It doesn't necessarily matter what it is, but you should have one. And speaking of foraging, that's another thing to take into consideration, and that would be your fifth thing. If it is a grid down situation, you're not going to be the only person. You or the people in your immediate circle are not going to be the only people who are looking for edible items like plants or berries or fruits or whatever it happens to be. So you have to take that into consideration, the scarcity of actual edible items that you can forage for, depending on where you live. That's going to depend on where your grid down shtf hideout is. If it's around your area, then and it's a remote location, then that's great. You won't necessarily have as large of a problem as someone who is in the city trying to find, let's say, like apple trees or peach trees or pear trees or blueberries or raspberries. Just something to take into account when you think about your location. You also have to think about the scarcity or the plenty of items that are edible around you for you to forage. The sixth thing that I think is really important to take into account would be your own head. The mental preparedness that you need to go through to be able to get yourself to the point where if that happens, you are okay and you have a plan and it's step A, B, C, D. And if step A goes wrong, we have step B squared and C squared and D squared to be able to deal with the ramifications and with the fallout. That's really important. And I think a lot of people underestimate, I'll deal with it when it comes. I'll deal with it when it happens. But have you actually thought about what's going to happen if and when that time comes? Because if you haven't, and you react in a panic, you're going to be no better off than the average person who has never thought about it before in their life. So my dad always used to say something to me. He always said, prior planning prevents piss poor performance. And I'm sure he got that from somebody. I'm sure that's a famous saying by somebody. But that's always what he said to me. And it kind of drove home the point that you always need to be prepared. You need to do your best to think through every sort of situation and be prepared for as many eventualities as you feel you need to be. Now, along the note of a grid down, food security or food insecurity situation, dealing with that in your own head, a really good way to start practicing for that or to just train your body. I mentioned physical fitness before, that's a consideration. You don't have to be a marathon runner, but you do need to have high levels of stamina. You don't need to need an excessive amount of food every day, but you do need to train your body to be able to survive on less. So intermittent fasting is a really good way to practice with that. Now, I'll be the first person to say I'm a foodie and I love my food, but I've also trained myself to go an extensive amount of time without eating. Because should that ever happen, I don't want to be caught off guard. I want to make sure that I have the necessary mindset and the necessary skills to be able to get through that situation. As a side note, it's also very good for discipline when you discipline your body that way. A couple practical tools that might be good to have on hand that are sort of immediate solutions only would be a small little propane cooking stove, such as one you might take with you when you go camping. Obviously, you have to make sure that you can carry that. If you have to be mobile and on the move, can you carry that with you? That also means that you need to have propane with you too. So someone in your circle, or you if you're by yourself, better be able to carry a propane tank. Then you also have the problem of what happens when you run out. Well, that's why I said it's only a short-term solution. In terms of a way to set yourself up for better success, having a go bag with essentials in it is going to be something that I think is a very good idea. You can have freeze-dried food in there until presumably you get to your first cache, or you know where you're going, so that you have a food supply that's there for you. The internet has lots of ideas in terms of like freeze-dried food and how to dehydrate food and pack food away so that you can pack as much as possible. I'm not necessarily going into that here. That wasn't the point of this video. I just wanted to give you guys a couple tips and a couple sort of considerations that you would want to have in mind should you be thinking about food prepping or should you be concerned about food security. The internet has lots of ideas about what foods to prep and what things you can stick into a go bag that are super small and super light and easily carried. There's lots of different processes you can do to make food take up as little space as possible. So use the internet, use your resources, because we have the world at our fingertips. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I'll be back on the next one.